Hi, my name is Elizabeth Kelly, and I will be discussing my community needs assessment that addresses housing insecurity and homelessness in the area that I live in. The purpose for this needs assessment is to evaluate the resources in this community for people who are experiencing housing insecurity and are homelessness, while also looking at what outside influences affect housing security. The reason why I thought this needs assessment was so important for this issue is because there's little to no affordable housing in this area. A two-bedroom house roughly starts at $500,000, and then the cheapest studio apartment I've ever seen here started at $750, and that did not include a washer, dryer, stove, or refrigerator. There's also no regulation, there's no laws or policies put in place that has designated a certain amount of affordable housing units in this area. Overall, there is a need and a crisis for housing accessibility because housing prices and the cost of living keeps going up, but the minimum wage does not. So it's just been very hard for the people in this community. The data collection process for this assignment was pretty simple. I did it in 3 steps. My first step was creating sample questions from the overall big question that I asked at the starting of this project. The second one was contact the organizations. I contacted these organizations through phone and did the interview that way. And then step 3 was to record and compile all of the data that I had gotten from these interviews. Overall, I interviewed 3 different agencies. The agencies were somewhat similar but also different. One agency provided emergency housing for people who needed it that day, and then the second one was just a referral agency who gave out referrals to people who were seeking long-term housing and somewhat of a quick solution. And then the last one was an agency who had received referrals for people who had been homeless for up to 3 years, starting at 1 year, who were looking for permanent housing. The first question I asked these agencies is, how has COVID changed the way your organization provides services? All of these organizations have been impacted by COVID quite significantly. The one that did emergency housing and on-site shelter, they had to limit the number of people that they allowed into their facility at one time because they weren't able to properly social distance. They're still able to house, I think, about 130 people at one time, but that number used to be way higher before the pandemic. And then the organization that just did referrals, all of their workers work remotely from home, so their only challenge was finding a way to keep in contact with the people that they were working with who don't always have consistent access to internet and a phone. And then the long-term housing facility for people who had been homeless for anywhere from 1 to 3 years, their need for services increased, but the accessibility decreased. So all the people who live in that property, they're all dealing with issues of substance abuse or mental health crises. And usually when they needed like an intervention, the workers would call someone like the workers would have to call someone like the police, or they would have to call the health department, like if there was a drug overdose. And because of COVID and social distancing, their community is seen as high risk, so it's taken a lot more effort and like advocating from the workers to be able to get those needs of the people met. And then compared to last year, how has the needs for services increased or decreased? All these organizations said that the service has increased. That being said, prior to the pandemic, there was still an increase every single year of people facing housing insecurity and homelessness. And then all of the organizations' target populations were people who are at risk for being homeless, who needed shelter, and then people who were facing housing insecurity or people who were currently homeless. Overall, all of the services have been harder to provide since the pandemic started. And all of these agencies are at full capacity besides the referral agency. The only issue they stumbled upon is everything is online now, so they have had to find ways to contact the people that their clients that they work with who don't have consistent access to phone or the internet. And then the other agencies are at full capacity. So for instance, the emergency shelter right now, they allow up to 130 people to stay there each night. But that being said, people cannot test positive for COVID. And there's other restrictions that come along with staying there as well. And then, what are two reasons you think housing insecurity is an issue in this area? All of the agencies I talked to discussed about the fact that this area is very expensive to live in and the minimum wage is not going up, but that housing prices are. There's also not any policies or practices put in place to really protect people who are at risk for housing insecurity or becoming homeless. And then there aren't any policies in place to aid in the issues of ongoing homelessness in this area. How long does it take for a person seeking housing to receive services? So, for the referral agency, it just depends on what the client is working for, and then they'll assess their needs from there. And then for long-term housing, for that organization, it can take anywhere from a year to up to 3 years. It's just depending on how many people have also applied to that location. And then for the emergency housing shelter, the people applying, they just cannot be currently using drugs or alcohol. They also have to not have any sickness, and then they can't have any mental health issues to be able to stay there. And then, what precautions has your organization made to keep you and your clients and workers safe? All of these organizations have provided PPE to the faculty and staff along with the people receiving services. And then the referral agency, everything is done online, so there's no face-to-face and like one-on-one contact. So for plans of interventions, there just needs to be more funding given from the local government, the local mayor, to these organizations that are help aiding in housing insecurity and homelessness. And then there also needs to be more education and destigmatization of homelessness. While I was doing this assessment, the mayor planned a local raid on a homeless camp downtown. About 100 people lost housing because of that raid, but the mayor also spent close to $200,000 on police force and SWAT to completely destroy this housing that these people have provided. So across the board, for the local government, there just needs to be more education because community members, people whose houses had been destroyed, were all angry, but they were all disappointed and upset that over $200,000 had been set aside to cause more destruction and chaos instead of being put to local policies that would create tiny houses and actual emergency safe housing for people in this local area who are currently on the streets. And then to share the findings, I will be emailing the people back with all of the things that I have found from my research project. One thing that stood out to me the most while doing this process, it just really made me aware of all of the financial aspects to housing insecurity and like the mismanagement of funds and in my area. And then it also brought to light again how difficult it is to conduct a needs assessment during a pandemic because many people take way longer than they did before to get like in contact through email because they're so overworked with other things. And if I hadn't been able to get in contact with someone over the phone or through email, then I wouldn't have been able to conduct this study because like I can't go in there in person. And then another thing that stood out to me, like I learned a lot more about my community and the aspects of homelessness that I hadn't really delved that far in before.